Childhood was behind the Iron Curtain, and work was exalted back then as the gestalt of everything. To be human meant to be a worker. And it was a particular kind of work that was celebrated too: hard work, manual labor. When I was in first grade, we were given a homework to draw the tools of work. And I remember I drew a shovel, a stethoscope, and somehow a desktop, an object which we did not own at the time. Upon seeing the drawing the next day, the school principal quickly summoned my mother to demand an explanation. How is it that a 6 years old knew what this capitalist bourgeois object was and what kind of subversive parenting was going on? Later, when I was 10, a friend of the family, a physician, advised me, Laura, you will not work for a living. You will think for a living. You just don't see the difference yet, but you will. And this turned out to be somewhat of a prophetic statement. I grew up to become a researcher, a profession where analytical thinking is key, and an anthropologist to boot, a discipline in which seeing and understanding difference and requiring an understanding of the changing meaning of things is fundamental. So pretty much as long as I can remember, I've been trying to see what happens if I push against dominant definition of things. What happens if I ask different questions about them and if I see them from a different angle? So this moment, this epochal moment that we are all collectively passing through with the new realities of work, presents a very compelling puzzle for me.
My life started with curiosity. I'm told that the first thing I did right after birth was lifting my head and taking a good look at the world where all other babies would lie and sleep. This curiosity has been a driver throughout my whole life, and this is why I'm investing all my time to extend my life indefinitely. There's just too many things I won't be able to see and learn with a lifespan that's limited to just 100 years. It also gives me a vested interest to think about large problems and their required solution. Because if you want to live indefinitely, you need a world worth living in. So what blueprints do we create for such a world?
So when I say the future of work, a new work, what would you draw? What is it that I am sketching out here with Rafael Hostettler in this impulse session? We want to provoke you to see differently.
We have always been changing how we work. We have been moving people away from agriculture and mining, and then away from manufacturing and towards service providing. This amounts to more than 70% of the workforce by now, and a lot of it no longer relies on physical labor, but only on basic cognitive processing. Now, with artificial intelligence and increasingly intelligent robotics, we are starting a displacement of those 70%. If you're a layer clerk used to analyze thousands of pages to find a pattern, or a radiologist looking at images of patients, a translator or an accountant, or even a manager, be prepared for a sudden but definitive change to your work reality. The big difference between automating a blue-collar job and automating a white-collar job is their physicality. Because for a machine to replace a human, I still need to build that machine, which is a very complex process which involves a lot of work at many places. And scaling the process is largely limited by the supply chain. This is not the case for white-collar jobs. They are like software, and once that software is developed, scaling is not limited by any physical factors. And I think this is largely underestimated. So there will be a shift of what people do, and that shift and the speed at which it's happening, it will be different for different kind of categories of work.
The way most people are seeing the future of work today is through a process perspective, probably driven by the reports looking at big data and macro trends. What they spell out is displacement out of one job category, potentially into another. They show the beginning of a dramatically changing occupational mix. For example, you see the 40% of Americans whose occupational category will change in the next 10 years. You see that this trend will impact already existing disparities in socioeconomic status and affect minorities the hardest. 25.5% of Hispanics, already overrepresented in certain sectors with increased risk of automation, are at risk of being displaced out of their jobs. Nearly 15 million workers under the age of 35 are in jobs at risk of automation as well, and the number of workers over 50 is close to 12 million now. Given the ever-growing upper limit of the retirement age, we cannot safely assume this group will not continue seeking employment. The reports also spell out potential geographic displacement. It is predicted that rural regions in particular will see negative job growth, and that although new jobs will appear, they will not appear in the same places, but rather shift toward large urban centers. So it's a picture of pervasive, ongoing, and dramatic change. And what these macro reports will converge on is always a single solution: reskill the individual.
Okay, think about a 40-year-old trucker that has been driving long haul for 20 years, and suddenly he's asked to become competitive with a 25-year-old programmer. It takes at least 10,000 hours to become a professional in a skill, no matter if it's coding or truck driving. So that is about 5 years of dedicated learning, of doing just that. Now, the reports are asking all of us to be flexible and to reskill. But what does that actually mean in real life? How can this reskilling even be accomplished, given our realities of life? And do we really want everyone to be a jack of all trades and a master of none?
Now, every trade, regardless of what level of complexity it is, comes with its own mastery, with its own routines, practices, experiences of time and space, its own jargon, and its own rituals and culture. This is what anthropologists often refer to as having habitus, knowledge, practice, so much that it becomes implicit and unspoken, an integral part of who you are. Habitus is always a question of embodying practices and realities. So when an anthropologist hears reskilling, they do not think of a synthetic displacement of one occupation category into another. They think how a single human being can be asked to both maintain the habitus of today, which pays the bills today, all the while adopting a new habitus for a new occupation. How does one deliver fresh produce across continent on a tight and highly regimented schedule with legally mandated rest stops, all the while staying current with something like, say, Java, which requires constant learning? Seen from the perspective of the individual, this task is formidable. So reskilling works in theory and in a process perspective, but in an individual and practical perspective, it likely won't work as envisioned precisely because the demand for reskilling fails to acknowledge and therefore does not solve for the embodied realities of work. It unfairly places the burden of change on the individual. Now, is there a way to capture and solve for these emissions of reskilling already before they happen? We want to provoke you today. While others see the future of work as depending on individual skill change, we see it as requiring the change of infrastructure in which work happens, starting with the human body and embodied experiences of work, all the way to the networks and technologies and practices which enable work. So instead of placing the burden of change onto the individual, we want you to see the future of new work not like a reskilled individual, but like a robot, like a change in infrastructure, not like a forcibly changed human being.
Let me make an example. Augmented reality will help reskilling by providing necessary context information when the user requires it. So he no longer has to learn everything by heart and understand everything about the job he's doing. And this can be provided by a system on a need-to-know basis. So this will mean that we will see a different kind of displacement. Instead of the individuals absorbing the demands of reskilling completely, we can build infrastructure that will change to accommodate the capabilities of these partially reskilled workers. And as an extreme form of infrastructure of reskilling, telepresence will not only decouple the physical presence of a worker with the place the work is done, but also by means of artificial intelligence and augmented reality built into this telepresence system, expand not only where a worker can do the work, but also which work he's actually capable of doing.
And if you want to keep seeing differently and dive deeper into the thicket to untangle what it takes to prepare society for a future with robots and as robots, especially from a humanist joint technicist perspective, talk to us at futureofwork@roboy.org.